Hello everyone and welcome back to Kobean history. When you think of cemeteries today, you might think of it as a sad place mostly deserted of people. But that wasn't always the case. In Roman times, cemeteries were often at the entrance of a city. And in the Middle Ages it could be seen more as a social place, more akin to a park, where you'd socialize with other people or engage in a variety of different activities. We'll be talking about that and more in today's video about the history of cemeteries and how they evolved and changed throughout the ages. Last year I made a video specifically about the history behind headstones, but in this video I wanted to take a broader look at cemeteries and burial places as a whole. On screen right now you can see the topics we'll cover in this video, so let's get started at the beginning. Marking the place where our dead are buried seems to be an instinct older than recorded history. The oldest known burial sites that we know, like dolmens or chamber tombs, were not like the cemeteries we have today. They were literal megalithic monuments made from huge stones or earth. While these could have served as a single burial site for a powerful person, more often than not, these were megalithic memorials built to mark an entire burial site, rather than an individual grave. Although inhumation was practiced regularly in the early Roman Republic, by the end of the Republic, cremation had become the most common, almost exclusive burial practice. Legislation forbade almost all burials within the ritual boundaries of Roman cities and towns. And often the graves or tombs of important people were placed next to the road going into the city. A famous example of this is the Appian Way in Rome, which was flanked by lavish tombs and mausoleums which you'd have to pass to get to the city. Now obviously if everyone would want to be buried next to the road leading into the city, you'd soon run out of space. And often cities of the dead or necropolises would spring up just outside the city boundaries. These cities of the dead had their own main and access roads, water supplies, and prime development sites for grander monuments or mausoleums. They also had amenities for visitors, including rooms for family dining and their own kitchens and kitchen gardens. Plots in these necropolises could be either rented or bought, with or without user-ready or customized tombs. Important families could also have their own family tombs, such as the tomb of the Scipios, for example. When the Anglo Saxons arrived in Britain, they built burial sites like the one at Sutton. Here a number of incredibly lavish burials have been uncovered, with the site consisting of multiple earthen mounds where the rich and powerful were buried with their most prized possessions. Sutton is of course most famous for its ship burial mound, but a number of other mounds and grave sites have been discovered in the area around it. There was another burial mound with a smaller boat in it, but also a number of mounds with cremated remains, as well as a few other grave sites where the dead had been buried without cremation. It is thought that the cremation sites at Sutton are the oldest ones, and during the Dark Ages these ship burials would have been only reserved for the wealthiest or most important people like rulers. It is thought that the person buried in the ship burial mound was the ruler of East Anglia. Then for the less wealthy or less important people, cremation was also common, but inhumation, such as burying the body in a grave without cremating, was also a less expensive alternative to cremation. Even still, regular people would not have been buried in a cemetery like Sutton. In the Dark Ages they probably wouldn't have been buried in cemeteries anyway, as when a family member died they would often be buried on that family's piece of land. The decline of the pagan burial tradition began with the Christianization of Anglo Saxon Britain. Cremation had been a relatively common practice, but it almost completely died out as Catholicism took over as the main religion. Now a tradition emerged of marking important graves with stone slabs laid over the grave, as well as large crosses that stood upright. This was particularly common for ecclesiastical graves, such as those at monasteries. William the Conqueror brought with him Norman practices and concepts such as Norman-style churches and monasteries, which were built all over the country. And with them came churchyards and graveyards, where those who could afford it could be buried in the church's public cemeteries, and being able to be buried within a churchyard was seen as a sign of wealth. As time went on, churchyards and cemeteries became more and more common, and while rich or noble people could afford a permanent grave, for the less wealthy, burial in the Middle Ages was sometimes only a temporary measure. People were often buried without coffins and left to decompose for a few years, after which the graves could be exhumed and the bones removed. The bones were then placed in the church's crypts or in a charnel house, which was a vault specifically for storing human skeletons. The emptied gravesite could then be reused by someone else. This was especially common within cities or towns, as cemeteries here would have limited space. As a little side note here, by the Victorian age these charnel houses fell out of use for their intended purpose, but for some Victorian people they still found these kinds of structures interesting, and some of these charnel houses actually became tourist attractions where people would buy tickets to go on tours in. By the late Middle Ages, cemeteries would have looked similar to those we have today, but they wouldn't have felt the same. Cemeteries back then were not hidden from view or enclosed within walls, and since they were near churches, they became a gathering spot for entire communities, and even markets could be held within the town's cemetery. People were known to drink and gamble in cemeteries, and it was also a common place to find prostitutes. Churchyard burials with headstones and coffins became more and more popular as time went on. At first this was mainly for the wealthy sectors of society, but it gradually also became more common with the lower classes as well. Almost everyone started to get a permanent gravesite, and churchyards soon ran out of space. We can see this in London, where during this time there was so much demand for gravesites that huge cemeteries were laid out on the outskirts of the city. And other cities like Paris, for example, also had similar cemeteries. These huge cemeteries were more akin to the necropolises of ancient Rome. These sprawling areas of graves and tombs no longer invoked the sense of community your small town churchyard had, and it's this that gave rise to the sad and lonely feeling we associate with cemeteries to this day. Thanks for watching, I hope you've enjoyed. If you're interested in more historical topics, please subscribe and check out my channel. And if you want to support what I do, please check out my Patreon page, which is on screen right now as well. I'd like to thank my patrons for their support, especially my $25 patrons, G. David and Parker Dye.